Welcome to our podcast, A Novel Talk, co-hosted by Carl Lee, and I'm Wendy Kendall. My new romantic mystery, Snow Kiss Cookies to Die For, is available at all online retailers. Desiree and Leo are tangled up in romance and mystery. She's a first grade teacher, and he's on the school's maintenance staff, and they're falling in love. Desiree's being stalked. By who? There are several suspects, including Leo. Is he Desiree's the one or the stalker? And my mystery book, Cat Out of the Bag, that's Cat with a K for Catherine Watson. She's a purse designer and amateur sleuth who goes from designer bags to body bags when she's faced with a murder mystery. In the prequel, Pistachio Makes a Splash, Catherine and Mayor Brenda Durling investigate a chilling cold case. Now I'm busy working on the exciting sequel. Just wait until you see what Catherine's facing this time. Thank you to all the readers who've let me know how much you enjoy my books. And here comes your co-host.
And one of those readers who enjoy your books. Hello, my name is Carl Lee, and I write paranormal fantasy. My first novel, hopefully, fingers crossed, will be released sometime this year. I'm looking forward to joining Wendy with the litany of titles.
I'm looking forward to that too, Carl. But our guest today, Amy Sommers, is a lifelong history fan with a strong interest in Chinese culture, language, history, and people. As a fluent Mandarin-speaking China-focused lawyer, in 2004, she moved to Shanghai with her husband and two young sons. Living and working in Shanghai during a period of intense legal, economic, and social change, she became intrigued by the city's pre-World War II incarnation, one that served as both a Mecca and a refuge for people from all over the world to reinvent themselves. Her debut novel, Rumors from Shanghai, explores the delights of a reinvented life and the dilemma of whether to risk it to avert a society-wide tragedy. In her novel, Amy Sommers' impressive knowledge of the history of two distinct cities, both Shanghai and Seattle, completely engage the reader as the incredible story of her characters is revealed. Welcome to A Novel Talk, author Amy Sommers.
Thank you, Wendy and Carl. I'm so pleased to be with you, and congratulations to both of you on the upcoming publication of your novels. I'm just really excited to talk to you about some of the aspects of Shanghai history and World War II history, and also, early Seattle history that merged together in creating this novel. So let's get into it.
Thanks, Amy. This book, Rumors from Shanghai, amazing story. Not a big history buff, but I loved this. I loved this book. The book centers around the theme of honor and duty. Could you talk about how duty to country and duty to friends or family differ?
Sure. So this story, for those of you who haven't read it, is set mostly in Asia. A little bit happens in the United States, but mostly in Asia in the year plus leading up to before the United States enters World War II. And the protagonist is faced, he reinvents himself and has this marvelous life he's created, and he has to face this dilemma of what to do with information he learns. And the story over time really explores these conundrums of, to whom do I owe a duty? And in his case, he's an African-American man of education and talent who's been denied opportunities because of his race, and yet gone abroad and found amazing opportunities, a path that was not unusual amongst ambitious African-American people in the 20s and 30s who found Jim Crow restrictions or disdain stifling, and went either to Europe or to Asia. And so he is trying to decide, when he learns of information, what he has to do and whether he does owe a duty to a country that has really not supported him or seen him as a fully human person. And then what does he actually owe to the people who have cared for him, and will he put them at risk if he tries to act to forestall a crisis that he believes is coming?
Your protagonist, Tolt Gross. Oh, he's so interesting. He travels to Shanghai from Seattle in 1940. One of his friends describes their group of friends that meet up in Shanghai as, quoting from the book, Mongolian ponies. Ronnie Jr., by the way, that's Tolt's business partner, called them screwy little animals that couldn't hold a candle to real American horses. Then Tolt interrupts, quote, yeah, right before the cunning beast took a leap over a creek that a 12-hand horse would have thought twice about before attempting. I love that quote. There's just so much emotion, and there's just so much in that, and it speaks to this protagonist so well. Can you tell us about this character Tolt and what he thinks of his new home and his friends there in Shanghai?
Yeah, so there are two aspects of backstory there. One, and this is always the case when you're working on historical fiction, one are the historical events that actually occurred, and then the other is how you weave your character's personal story into that context. And in Asia, the first foreigners who really settled in Shanghai were the Brits after they defeated China in a war in the early 1840s over the right to sell drugs to Chinese, and it was over the sale of opium. And once they set up shop there, they wanted to pursue a lot of the same leisure sports and entertainment that they pursued in England. And of course, we know that fox hunting was a big thing in the English countryside. Shanghai wasn't that big at that point. And they wanted to fox hunt, but of course there were no foxes in Shanghai, which is very flat. It was, Shanghai literally means on the sea. It was adjacent to the ocean. So they tried to improvise, and there were horses that were brought down from Mongolia that were these tiny little horses, and the many you read again and again of people encountering them and thinking, well, these are so much smaller than our English horses or American horses, but they were actually very strong because they had to be able to run for long distances in Mongolia, and they were very smart. And so what the British did was, since they couldn't fox hunt, they created paper chase hunting, where they would lay trails of different colored paper across streams and all to replicate the experience of fox hunting. And then there are all these notorious stories of the Mongolian ponies actually proving very wily and throwing their riders off into, pits of manure, or refusing to go places. And so that anecdote is sort of capturing this dichotomy between people who look down on what they think of as lesser in this new place, and then people who know more about it and realize, no, there's more here than meets the eye. The backstory for the characters is that Tolt had studied law in the United States and at the University of Washington, and there had been foreign exchange students, one with whom he became close, who was from China, and one from Japan. And they then, after graduating, returned to their families, and they are all reunited in Shanghai. So he has gone from graduating and not being able to get a job to landing in Shanghai through connections his father has, and getting to experience all these wonderful things that he would have been foreclosed from experiencing as fully in America of that time. So he's really thrown himself into it. And because he has this particular background, having grown up in unusual circumstances, he knows a lot more about what's going on in Shanghai and the cultural context than the guy he's working with, who comes from a very affluent American family, but who thinks he knows everything. And so that exchange that Wendy cited to is kind of drawing out that difference between them and their differences in how well they're able to actually navigate and thrive in this new world that they're in.
That is such a fun contrast between these two business partners. Their
Yeah.
personalities are so different. It's fascinating.
And that difference points out another theme in the book, that being the role of race at this time period in time, and also
Hmm.
the perception of being an outsider. Um, Tolt and Ronnie Jr. have a conversation about how in America, Tolt was an outsider, and here in Shanghai, he's also an outsider, even though he has friends and good friends here. Um, and that brings in a deeper conversation about how Tolt's grandfather um, and Ronnie's father made the arrangement to bring, to have Tolt work for Ronnie here in Shanghai. Can you talk more about the seniors' relationship? Because that's a very
Sure.
special part.
Yeah, so that actually grew out of my interest in early Seattle history. Um, and those two characters are inspired by real people. Um, the second Black resident of Seattle was a man named William Gross, who had this amazing, almost mythic life of his own, where he, in the 19th century, went to work on U.S. Navy ships and went all over the world. And then he ended up at the end of that period. I mean, he went to Russia and China and Japan and Antarctic or North Pole, or I forget, one of the poles. And then he ended up in California in working as a cook in mining camps during the gold rush. And he was part of, this was before the Civil War, he was part of the Underground Railroad trying to save people who were enslaved. And he was asked to actually go to Panama to negotiate with the Panamanian officials to prevent some of those people from being returned by their human trafficking owners who tried to get them back. Then he went to Canada and he worked in a mining camp up in British Columbia. And then he came to Seattle, and he had various businesses in Seattle, but he went on to become a very successful hotelier and restaurateur, and then one of the first real estate developers in Seattle. And when he died, he was like the second or first biggest taxpayer in Seattle because he owned so much land. But one of the things that he was really noted for was he was very generous to other newcomers. And when Robert Moran, who was one of the early Seattle mayors, showed up on the Seattle waterfront with a dime, the stories vary, a dime or 25 cents in his pocket. He was 17 years old. He smelled the good food coming out of Bill Gross's restaurant and went over and begged a meal on credit. And then Gross ended up helping him find his first jobs and kind of introducing him around. So, Moran went on to become the founder of a very successful shipyard. He became a city council member, and then the mayor. He is most known today as the man who donated the land for Moran State Park on Orcas Island, and he built the beautiful mansion, which we now know as Rosario Resort. So I was very interested in this idea of two people who were early settlers, both of whom were very successful, but one we know of, Moran, and one until relatively recently was really forgotten. But how if you were somebody early on in Seattle who could thrive, you could create connections and achieve things that maybe you wouldn't have been able to in more established parts of the United States. And so the backstory between Tolt getting to have this job is that his grandfather's best friend, is the character Ronnie Senior, who's sort of inspired by a Robert Moran type character, and that has given him this chance to come work internationally that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise been afforded.
Obviously,
Interesting.
so lifelike. Yeah. Opportunity strikes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, now I want to ask our listeners, what if you knew information about a plan for a terrifying plot being planned against other unsuspecting people? And this is more than rumors. You want to stop it. You go to the people who can stop it, but they don't believe you. Can you imagine living that nightmare as you know the clock is ticking down to disaster? Amy, as a historian, What prompted you to explore this personal conflict in your book?
Well, that's a really great question. And actually, this will sound perhaps like a little bit of an odd answer, but it was the events of 9/11 that initially got me interested in trying to tell this kind of story. Because in the months after 9/11, I kept reading news articles about various people who saw that there was something anomalous going on, or that certain threats had actually been made. Um, but they weren't listened to. And there was, for example, there were FBI agents in various parts of the country who raised alarms because these men from Saudi Arabia kept wanting to learn how to fly commercial aircraft, but they didn't seem to be interested in getting jobs, and they only wanted to learn how to take off, not land. And they tried to sound the alarm, and they weren't listened to. There were a number of instances like that, and that got me curious about the question of whether such a dynamic had happened before in American history, where we had faced an attack and it was presented as a surprise, and sure, the specifics of it were a surprise, but actually the threat had been warned of. And so when I started researching that question, I started coming across information about Pearl Harbor, and it turned out that a similar dynamic had unfolded in the months leading up to Pearl Harbor. And in that case, it was often that the people who were warning that there was something afoot came from racially marginalized or groups who were seen as not credible or having an axe to grind, and therefore their warnings weren't heeded. And the upshot was that America was caught entirely flat-footed. And the other dynamic, of course, with Pearl Harbor was that the American leadership, both in the military and in the government, saw the Japanese as backward and imitative and not technically innovative. And they had, in their own military analyses, determined that it was impossible to launch a naval attack at Pearl Harbor because the waters were so shallow, and the torpedoes at that time wouldn't operate, and naval aviation was at its infancy. And so there were all these reasons why Americans believed it was impossible. So the idea that this, in quotes, backward nation of imitative people would manage to do it struck them as impossible. And so we ended up not taking advantage of the opportunity to put in place adequate defenses. And so I really wanted to explore this idea of what happens when you do know something. At first you hope it's not real, but then you conclude, because you know something yourself, you have a historical context to understand what's happening, and nobody will listen to you.
It's so well written too. As you're reading it, you feel like somebody listened to what they're planning. You forget that it's history because you get so caught up in the writing. It's so well done.
Well, thank you. That's what I was hoping for.
Mission accomplished. Speaking of the Japanese Navy, the character Takata seemed to be playing a game of cat and mouse with Tolt, stating once to Tolt that it was a good strategy to strike first, then declare war. What more can you tell us about the Japanese Navy officer Takata?
Yeah, he too is inspired by a real figure. And the background is that, after World War I, when these European empires started to dissolve, Japan really held itself out as a new form of empire. That they were of the darker races is often what's talked about, and that they offered an idea of a more humane imperial system, and that they sought connection with other peoples of the world. Again, using that term, the darker skinned peoples of the world. And they were particularly, the Japanese government and intellectuals and academics and just average people were very interested in the African American experience, having been subjected to oppression for hundreds of years, and yet managing to retain this vitality in African American culture. So you have characters, real people from Japan, going around the world and interacting with people, and in fact trying to influence African Americans in in the United States and their thinking, and to be more sympathetic to Japan. And so this character, Takata, who's inspired by a real character, a real person, the Japanese military, Minoru Genda, is innocent of those dynamics. And then the other thing that was going on was that Japan had, in wars with China in 1894 and 1895, and in a war with Russia in 1904 and 1905, both, they were sort of considered the underdog against both of those opponents. They had used very bold naval attacks prior to the official declaration of war to catch their opponent off guard and seize the momentum. And the Pearl Harbor attack really was not planned very long in advance. So the serious planning for it only started in the winter of 1941. So it was planned in less than a year. And the thing we forget was that at that time, naval aviation was really in its true infancy. And it, at that time, people still did their planning, in England and in the United States and even in Japan, envisioning that battles between navies would be fought just as they had been for hundreds of years, where you would send out these big battleships and you would have these cannon and they would, blast at each other. And Minoru Genda, was this very innovative and successful naval aviator who believed that you could use naval aviation as a new force to give you much more nimbleness and flexibility. And so he conceived of this whole attack that you could take these aircraft carriers across the sea and launch them out in these very rough oceans and use torpedoes and dive bombing to disable the fleet, the American fleet. And that was considered, preposterous and impossible. And so part of the dynamic that my protagonist is encountering is that he's saying that what's going to happen is something that everybody is of the belief could not happen. It's impossible to happen. And yet he has very good reasons for explaining why he believes that this is true.
Now, Shanghai, before America's official entry into World War II, to quote from your book, Rumors from Shanghai, that dazzling neon-bathed cosmopolis, blending peoples from around the world, engrossed in dealing, toiling, scheming, cabareting, eating, dancing, and drinking their way through life. The end of the quote. I love that description. In your book, Shanghai life is so vivid, as is the way the city changes during this historic time in 1940 to 1941. As the author, what is important to you when writing about settings?
Yeah, I think I once took a workshop from Elizabeth George, and she talked about how sometimes stories are really led by characters, sometimes they're really led by plot. Sometimes the setting becomes almost a character. And I do think that that's really true in some places. Paris is a place that ends up shaping, movies or novels, just because it is so dynamic. And I think the same can be said for Shanghai. And I certainly, one of the things that was really clear to me when I moved there in the early 2000s was there was still quite a bit of that old architecture. And there were still older people who had grown up then in that period before the communists took over. And then there were people who were fascinated by it, who were doing all this research about it. And so you could see both, imagine what it was like then and how amazing it was as this, place that was such a melding of both Western influences and Chinese influences. And then you could also see it being that again in the early 20th century or 21st century, where the Chinese were just so delighted at that time to see the reforms that they had been, pursuing for the last 20 years start to come to fruition, and all this opportunity and dynamism being unleashed. And so I was very interested in what I was experiencing, which was sort of like the 21st century version of that passage you just read, but also how that time had left such a mark, and there were still people who spoke so fondly of what that city was and what it created for them or what it meant to them.
Yeah, that's that's an amazing perception. Hey, Tolt has a very unique childhood, living in his grandfather's boarding house. There are two men, Ping and Sato, that work for his grandfather while he's growing up. What can you tell us about the relationship between Tolt the boy and these men?
Yeah, so the backstory there is that um, we think of in the case of Chinese who are in the Pacific Northwest, we think of them as being laborers, of the type who came to work on in the gold rush or on the trains building the railroad. And there definitely was that. But in the Pacific Northwest, there was also this other less known history that's I find fascinating of people who were more intellectual or affluent, came from more affluent backgrounds, who escaped China as imperial reform was foundering, and people who were trying to act as proponents for reform inside China were being chased out of the country. And there were people coming through the Pacific Northwest of that background. And then you also had human smuggling going on from Vancouver Island, from Victoria, down through the San Juan Islands into the Pacific Northwest. And some of those people were just workers. Some were people who were trying to get a better opportunity. And so in the case of Ping, I imagined him as somebody who was of this cadre of people who were failed reformers and who had come. And when the people I've met in my life in Taiwan and mainland China who lost everything during the wars that happened there, and the revolutions, they held on to their sense of their culture and history as sort of like this badge of honor that they carried with them that meant something to them. And similarly, in Japan, because of poverty in the late 19th century, many Japanese had to leave their home farms or their fishing villages, and they went to Hawaii or elsewhere to pursue opportunities. And so I imagined both Ping and Sato as these people who had to leave because they had to, but they were very proud of their history. And the way they honor that is by sort of infusing it into this child who's living with them, and the way they compete over their both Chinese and Japanese cultures are sort of chauvinistic about them being very refined in very different ways. And so the way they acted out that their sense of chauvinism and pride of their society was to show that they could teach this little boy more than the other, or that their society or culture mattered more to him than the other. And so you can imagine him maybe as being a little bit of like a goose being fattened up for foie gras, where he's got all these adults who are, intent on making sure he absorbs the lessons. And then in the course of the story, it turns out sort of random things that they had taught him or explained to him were in fact drivers of dynamics that maybe more arrogant or condescending Americans saw as irrelevant. But he could sort of see how some of these pieces fit together, and he draws on those things that he's been taught to try, and it helps him thrive in his work life, but also it helps him understand some of the things he's being told that seem impossible, that other people see as utterly unrealistic.
Yeah, I love that aspect of the book.
Tolt experiences such a romantic relationship with Diana. I was delighted in one scene with yet another example of your skillful use of the unexpected to make an insightful impact. In this case, it's when you cite a brief description of Diana's handbag, which is distinct. I'm a handbag lover, and I write in my mystery, Cat Out of the Bag, about how purses reflect the history of women through the decades, and also the clues of how personal a woman's purse is. And you show this idea so stunningly. Anyways, can you tell us a little about this character, Diana?
Sure. One of the things that's very interesting about 1949, so pre-communist China, was that you had the presence of these Western missionaries in parts of China, and Shanghai was a very international city. So I've met people in the course of my studying China and Chinese for, going back 35 plus years, who were raised in, going to missionary schools or living around Westerners who spoke amazing English. And so you had this era where these people were very comfortable in their home culture, if they were in Beijing and being, from northern China, or if they're from Shanghai being, Shanghainese, but they also were very comfortable with operating in a very Western world. And I saw Diana as that kind of person who could really move with great confidence in both worlds. And if any of your listeners are interested in a real person who's like that, there's a wonderful memoir that's come out in the last few years by a woman named Isabel Chow called Remembering Shanghai, about growing up in pre-1949 Shanghai. And I think of Isabel Chow, it came out after I'd already finished my book, but I think of her as sort of like a real life Diana. And it's just a wonderful book. So I highly recommend that for people who are interested in that period.
I thought of you, Wendy, when I read that passage about the handbook. I really did.
Thank you. It's so well
There's
done.
there's a lot of sword play in Rumors from Shanghai. Tolt was taught to fence. Ronnie mentions instead of getting straight answers from Tolt, he gets stabbed with an epee. Theoretically, anecdotally, however you want to look at that. Can you tell us about the Kendo sparring between Tolt and Takata? That was a very key scene, I thought.
Oh, yeah. So Kendo, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the practice whereby Japanese swordsmen would do their practice without using real swords, and they would use what we would think of as bamboo lances. And the view of Japanese people is that Kendo is much more like a chess match and very strategic, and that there are different moves that you do that reflect different, again, using chess as a metaphor, sort of different styles of play. But if you read about European fencing, very skilled fencers feel similarly about that. And what interested me about Kendo was, again, going back to this idea of people treasuring their culture, is that I had read when in the 90s of one of the most prominent Western journalists who worked in Shanghai and then elsewhere in China, and she moved to Shanghai in the 30s, and her name was Emily Han, and her life would make such a fascinating film. And she became, the common law wife of this very wealthy Shanghainese guy who was an avant-garde poet, and she became addicted to opium, and then she left as the Japanese were circling during the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. She left and she went to Chongqing and she went to Hong Kong. Anyway, she ended up having an affair with the British Army attaché named Charles Boxer, who was an expert on Japan. And Boxer, if you're the attaché to the embassy or the consulate, you're essentially a spy. You're a Navy spy or an Army spy, but everybody recognizes it. So Boxer had spent time in Japan in the 20s, and he became fluent in Japanese, and he became very interested in Kendo. And one of the things that was really interesting to me reading about him was that after Japan took possession of Hong Kong on December 25th, 1941, the Battle of Hong Kong ended. They committed all sorts of atrocities against the British forces, but Boxer was given quite humane treatment during this period, and it was because they respected him as being so knowledgeable about their culture that they saw him as really a person who deserved more respect than the most lowly Westerners who didn't. So it sort of reinforced to me that these cultural things, these sports or arts, or however you want to think of them, are things that allow us to connect with each other and to be seen as worthy of trust or engagement.
The dialogue between the characters is so well done, very realistic and honest to the time period. And it's also distinct between characters. As the author, what's important as you write characters' conversations?
That is such a good question, Wendy. I think the thing that's hardest is for me, I mean, you all might have very different experiences, but um, is thinking of the time in which the characters are speaking. So, if you listen to films or read memoirs or news stories from the 30s, people tended to talk in much shorter, kind of snappier sentences. It's like um, much more jazzy almost. And so I really tried to change the rhythm of how I would normally think of talking, or how, if these are modern characters, that they would talk, to try and capture that. And I think if you're going to write in a particular place, if the geography really plays a role in the story, or a particular time, that is a big challenge that you have, as a writer, have to confront or deal with in some way.
Well, definitely jazzy was the thought I had when I was reading this dialogue. It seemed very. It did. It did. Another reason why it was such a quick read was that it was very punchy like that. I bet our listeners would love to hear some of this punchy dialogue and snappy description. Would you mind doing a reading for us?
I'd love to. I'm going to read. So I can't read to you all from very far into the book because some of the plot points start to get really revealed. But my protagonist, Tolt, arrives in Shanghai in the autumn, which is the best time to go to Shanghai. And this is from an early chapter set in October, and he's going to meet his law school classmate, Quentin, whom he's known for years now. He's going to meet his father. So as the car pulled up on the gravel drive in front of the clubhouse, Tolt stepped out into the balmy air, marveling once again that early October in Shanghai felt as warm as Seattle in July. He spied Quentin and his father standing on the stone patio before the clubhouse's main entrance. The resemblance that Mr. Wong bore to the actor John Gilbert was striking. Both wore their hair parted in the center and sleekly combed back, with dark straight eyebrows paralleled by a trim, dark mustache. Mr. Wong's build was slimmer in cast than Quentin's muscular frame, but there was definitely a commonality in the confident way each man carried himself. In the pictures Quentin had shown Tolt of his family, his father had worn either a traditional long Chinese gown or formal Western suit. But today he was kitted out in golf attire, albeit quite formally, wearing a suit of tan tweed with plus fours, rather than the more casual version of plus fours paired with a sweater vest that Quentin wore. Quentin did the honors, and Mr. Wong reached out to shake Tolt's hand with a warm smile. Tolt replied how long he had desired to meet Elder Uncle Wong, an honorific that made Mr. Wong smile even more broadly. As they entered the clubhouse, Diana bounded over to them, holding hands with Sumiko, and exclaimed, "Ah, here you are, and now that we are all together, we shall have some fun." Sumiko smiled as she greeted Tolt with a polite bow. Tolt was delighted and surprised at Diana's being there, so much so that he was surprised at his own reaction. Trying to cover his befuddlement, he took in Sumiko's golf ensemble and asked, "Sumiko-san, I didn't know you play golf." "Oh, yes, I started learning when I was at school in Switzerland," she beamed. "I love it. Any chance I get, I play." "And wait till you see her. She's so good," interjected Diana. Sumiko playfully slapped her friend's arm. "Don't say that. It's bad luck." "Never," laughed Diana. "No golf for you today, Miss Wong?" Tolt asked with a grin. "Not my game, thanks," she said, returning the smile. As Mr. Wong and Quentin started to head out to the course, Diana skipped over to her father, tucking her arm into his and leaning close to him. They led the group through the French doors leading out onto the course. "Our cousins are already out at the first tee. Come this way," she called over her shoulder. Falling a few steps behind, it struck Tolt that he had often observed Diana taking leadership of her group, but her little girl-like gesture in holding on to her father reflected a submissiveness he hadn't previously seen. With their father's presence, the bustling and attentive service that enveloped Quentin and Diana wherever they went was magnified by a significant factor. Tolt grinned as he observed a man trailed by a bevy of potential caddies approaching them, and he could see from the corner of his eye another fellow who was emerging from another wing of the clubhouse, adjusting his jacket and pulling his shirt cuffs as he hurried over to greet Mr. Wong. Quentin and Diana didn't seem to notice the hubbub, and Tolt thought he detected a glint of humor in Mr. Wong's eye as servers hurried to offer him cool cloths to wipe his brow, a drink, while the course manager extolled the strengths of the different caddies. The presence of 4 of Quentin's cousins added to the melee. As everyone chatted and proposed who should play with which caddy, the pandemonium escalated to a din. And still Mr. Wong appeared genial, calm, and unaffected. Marveling at Mr. Wong's sang-froid, Tolt wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. In the shower of attention directed at Mr. Wong, no one had thought to offer him so much as a glance. He contemplated whether the combination of heat and noisy racket were likely to induce a migraine. Mr. Wong and the cousins were locked in a vociferous discussion which sounded like it might be escalating into an outright argument. They were speaking Shanghainese, so Tolt couldn't fully understand, but he gleaned the topic was which foursome should go first. Mr. Wong was adamant it should be his guests, the cousins, and they were equally vociferous that it would be poor form to go before their Uncle Wong. Tolt smiled to himself as he twisted and stretched in preparation for the game. A touch to the back of his shoulder made him look back. Diana was holding onto the head of one of Sumiko's clubs and had poked him with the handle. When he turned around, she assumed a mock fencing stance and extended the club as if it were her weapon. In her deepest voice, she said, "Sir, I challenge you to a duel." Tolt was about to accept when Mr. Wong called in a sharp tone, "Daughter, be careful. You could injure someone." Upon hearing this admonition, he expected Diana to object or make some mocking reply to minimize the concern expressed. But instead, she lowered the club and apologized. "I'm sorry, Father," she said with a contrite look on her face. I'm going to skip up a little bit and go to the next page ahead of where I was just reading. One of the caddies presented Mr. Wong with a cup of tea on a tray. He took a sip, then asked, "Have you heard of Eugene Chun?" Tolt was even more puzzled. Wasn't he the foreign minister in the 1920s? Yes, at various times he served as foreign minister. Mr. Wong waved away the caddy, who was now proffering him a cool cloth. Chun grew up in Trinidad, and his wife was part French and part African, so their children are a mixture of Chinese, Western, and African races. I met Chun's son Percy when he was in Shanghai. A handsome and dashing young man. You and he have similar colored skin. It made me wonder whether you too might have some Chinese blood. Mr. Wong's query, while blunt, didn't strike Tolt as being provoked by any malice. Indeed, he didn't sense any anti-Negro feeling in his attitude. Tolt concluded that this was another instance of the Chinese ability to be frank in a way that Americans often found disconcerting, such as when Chinese asked how much money you earned or told you were fat. It was all about getting to the facts at hand.
I love the scene at the golf course with everybody fawning over Uncle Wong. Thank you for the reading.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yes, thank you. And also, thank you so much, Amy Sommers, for joining us for a novel talk. This has been really fun. Listeners, you will want to check out the website amysommers.net for more information about the author and her fascinating blog, and more information about her touching, thrilling, and fascinating book, Rumors from Shanghai. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Remember, a novel read leads to a novel talk.